Hello, my name is Allison, and welcome to my adventures on the platform formerly known as Twitter. I found the most prolific feminist L-taker I have ever met. In the 2 decades plus that I've had these arguments online, I believe this woman might have taken the most L's as a feminist. She kept coming back for more and taking more L's and apparently being completely unaware that she was doing so. It's quite amusing, and I'm bringing it to you today for your edification. If you're having a bit of a rough day, at least you can watch this and say, I am not this person. And what's amazing about it is, again, she's completely oblivious to the fact that she's throwing out L after L like some kind of loser pinata. My tweet was, get rid of man at fault divorce and say that again when your husband isn't chained to you. And to just give you a context, some woman was talking about withholding sex isn't a thing because it implies you're entitled to someone else's body, and you're not. I mean, tell that to the feminists who created the Duluth model and consider withholding sex a form of abuse if men do it. But let's set that aside. This is the individual. Her name is Diane Yap. You can stop confessing to my replies that you're unable to make your own wife want you. It's pathetic. No wonder she's not interested. And that's what I responded to, because honestly, that's fine. You could say no to your husband, sure. But I'd like that to be in the context of a situation where he can walk away from you just like you can walk away from him. That's why I meant get rid of no man at fault divorce and then say that. In the current situation, all of the factors that would apply to a man, if he had been the reason why a marriage broke down, apply to men blanket in the current system. He gets the at fault ending, the man at fault ending, regardless of why they walked into the divorce court. If they walked into the divorce court because she was bored, she lost interest in him sexually, doesn't matter. Again, it's the man at fault ending. If they walked into the divorce court because she was abusive, man at fault ending. If they walked into the divorce court because she cheated on him, man at fault ending. Now it all is the man at fault ending. Used to be, if the woman it was at fault, there would be a woman at fault ending, but they got rid of that. So it's now just the man at fault ending. And I was saying, well, I mean, sure, you can say things like, I just don't feel obligated to be intimate with my partner, my romantic partner. I've decided that despite making a pledge to be in a romantic relationship with someone, I don't want to uphold my half. Well, say that again in a system where it's not man at fault divorce. Yeah, where your husband has as much ability to walk away from you as you have to walk away from him. And in response to that, Lilith's disciple says the following. And I got a really newfangled thing that I can show you guys that I think you'll like, or hopefully you'll like. Listen to this.
There's no such thing as man at fault divorce, just like there's no such thing as divorce rape.
I can now use another voice to do the readings for the feminist part of these conversations. So maybe this will become clearer who is speaking. But anyway, so my response to that is, the same conditions apply to men during all divorce as it did when it was at fault divorce and when the man was determined to be at fault. Lilith responds with,
No fault divorce is based on the right to divorce without having to prove fault. Men and women benefit from it, unless you want men to provide evidence that their wives cheated on them to have the right to end the relationship.
Well, that would be better than the situation we have currently, which is that it just automatically goes to man at fault. Used to be you had to prove the man was at fault to get the man at fault ending, but now you don't. So if you gave men the opportunity to prove that the woman was at fault to get the woman at fault ending, that would be a massive improvement for men. Don't threaten me with being completely right.
These people literally have to invent absurd rape subcategories like child support rape or divorce rape in order to gain sympathy. That is how mental they are.
And then I just inform her, well, women rape too, so we could just use that. And I show her the stats. And we go back and forth on the stats. You guys all know this. I have a set of stats that I've compiled over the last few decades regarding women's sexual abuse of men and boys. They show that women engage in substantial amounts of sexual abuse of men and boys. If you're going to assert that men are the majority rapists as a scientific assertion, one bit of counter evidence sends that back to the table. And I got more than one. But anyways, we go back and forth on that. I don't want to get into it because she uses the usual nonsensical stuff. Lilith's disciple starts to get into an argument over bargaining power. I think it's because anti-feminists said there's no systemic subjugation of females. First of all, systemically men have more hurdles, and secondly, that individual women and men are oppressed is not evidence of systemic oppression. And Lilith's disciple says the following.
I don't think you understand how bargaining power works. Men as a group have more bargaining power. It's natural considering they are the ones who got the monopoly on force.
And anti-feminist responds very sensibly, there's no such thing as men of a group outside of the feminist la-la land. I'm going to introduce a concept here. It is what I term Feminus Andronicus. Feminist Andronicus. Now, I'm going to use a parallel to explain what Feminist Andronicus is. Economists have theories about how the economy works, and a lot of these theories rely on a human being that acts perfectly rational. And because that human being sort of differs from the average human being, they've started to refer to the human being that exists in economic theories as Homo economicus. I thought we could do the same thing with feminist theories or conjecture, because they have sort of a idea of the way men are that isn't actually reflected in reality, but it's a emergent property of their conjecture about how society is structured. And I thought we could call that man Feminus Andronicus, which is basically what men would be if feminist conjecture was correct, which it isn't, because it's nothing like what men actually are. While economic theories can have some validity even if the people in them don't really act like human beings, they can help bracket ideas. Whereas the feminist conjecture about men is just complete bullshit from stem to stern and offers no valid insight into anything. But I find it amusing to just imagine what the feminist Andronicus would do. I know what men would do, but what would the feminist Andronicus do? But anyway, Lilith's disciple basically is appealing to the feminist Andronicus, which is men who have some kind of group identity, which we've proven through studies that men don't. There's no in-group bias when it comes to men. There is for women, but there is not for men.
Men have the monopoly on force. There's an individual and a collective. The reason men were more likely to impose their will on women for centuries is precisely for that reason.
This is appeal to feminist Andronicus, because while men have a monopoly on force, in every culture I've studied, that force is considered illegitimate when it's used against women. Sometimes it's acceptable in the context of punishment. For example, a man might be responsible for punishing his wife when she's found guilty of something in a public context. But generally, men are not allowed to use violence against women. Islam, for example, can hit but leave no marks. Yeah, that doesn't sound great, but consider that there's no control over the violence that women could do men. And as we have seen from studies, there is actually a substantial amount of female on male violence in the Middle East. According to anonymous surveys, there's more than the reverse. The fact that society chooses to put limits on men's violence towards women, but no limits on women's violence towards men. There's other things like, for example, the Wehrgild laws, which put a higher Wehrgild on anybody who murdered a woman versus a man, and had a bunch of penalties for violating women's physical boundaries, not just in terms of murdering, but also in terms of physically, like touching or assaulting. They had special prohibitions against doing that to women. In our own society, we have a whole bunch of laws that apply to violence and sexual abuse of women. Like, they're the only recognized victims. So, I don't know. Yes, men have a monopoly on the use of force, but society puts a lot of work into when and how men can use that force, and most often it's not against women. Use of force against women is not considered acceptable and has a lot of legal constraints, whereas women's use of force against men doesn't. It's just a free-for-all. By that logic, men would have imposed their will on women for all of human existence. She responds with,
Capitalism gave women some bargaining power too. It's still very limited compared to the monopoly on force men have.
yes, but they're always going to have a monopoly on force as long as you don't acknowledge that men also use their force to enforce certain codes of behavior on each other towards women. Right? If you're not going to acknowledge that human beings are more complex than just force, then you're basically preloading failure. I said, what's your proposal to gain power?
Funny how you blame me for thinking that way when a few days ago you were telling women that if they can't defend their rights, then these rights were never theirs to begin with. It's almost as if you understand that it's still men who call the shots even now.
So I respond, what's your proposal to gain power? Let's make this productive. I mean, she's distracting onto something else that I said, but I'm not interested because, first of all, she's mischaracterizing what I said. I'm again talking about the inability, like reducing everything down to force and not recognizing that there's certain other additional aspects to human beings' social behavior than just force. That's true about every animal, including primates, chimpanzees. There's more to their hierarchies than force. And we're even more socially complex than that. For example, the most powerful male chimp may rule the hierarchy, but he has to have a coalition. But also, if the females don't like him, he's probably going to be gone. Right? So there's more going on than just pure force here. But regardless, I just want to get to the brass tacks. What's her proposal to solve the issue of the fact that men have greater force?
My personal proposal, and the proposal other feminists before me have made, is to combine our forces with other women, to act as a single, solid block within society. But the problem is that there are too many traitors in our camp.
By traitors, she means women like me who say, explain this. And then I respond with, even as a single solid block, you still can't outmuscle men. If you're going to say that men use force on women, and that's why they control everything, and well, that's it then. Men control everything. Unless you genetically engineer women to be bigger than men, well, it's just the way it is. And even if you come together as a block, you're still going to be trounced by men. Lilith responds with,
Better chances still, and we don't have to confront men directly either.
okay, so now she's saying that women will have better chances confronting men as an organized military bloc. I have serious doubts. So this is what I respond with. Not really, because once you create your united female military bloc, the feminist Andronicus will organize against you and destroy you with both superior fighting and logistical capabilities. And how do you plan to not confront men directly? Now, here's the thing. Actual men would not respond militarily to this. Well, first of all, I don't think women have ever organized militarily against men. But if they did, I'm not sure that men would respond, would give a military response. But if they actually did, which would require questioning some very deeply held parts of ourselves as men and women, but let's just say they did respond as feminists conjecture they would just construct a bigger, better equipped, organized, and logistically supported army and crush your army, ladies. Because they have monopoly on force. But I'm interested now in the plan not to confront men directly. And Lilith responds with,
I would rather try than not try, and yes, we have better chances if we organize collectively. Do you have better ideas that might be more genius?
the man of feminist imagining, feminist Andronicus, who does not care about women's security or safety and regards women as an enemy combatant, would simply organize against you. She's also now starting to evade the question of how she's going to do this without confronting men directly. Seem to have the answer yourself. What do you mean by not having to confront men directly? And Lilith's disciple says,
That's a long story.
go ahead and answer it.
I think it needs more than just a few responses, and I will need more time to think about what are the avenues we can take.
And I respond with, you've had 70 years to come up with something. All you have is organize into a woman force and get trounced by feminist Andronicus. A man is imagined through feminist conjecture. And no answer. Men have the monopoly on force, and they always have and always will. But somehow feminists have some thing that they're going to do that's going to somehow change that. And one plan is that women are going to organize in an army, and they're going to directly challenge men's monopoly on force. And that's not going to result in them being annihilated, right? Even though men have the monopoly on force. Why is that? Why is it if women organize in a block, they aren't going to be militarily annihilated? I think there's something happening here that this individual doesn't want to discuss. It doesn't want to clarify that whole, we're not going to confront men directly. No shit, you're not going to confront men directly, because according to your own theories, they'll wipe you off the planet. But what is this other thing that you're doing? I can tell you what it is, which is why it makes it so hilarious that she talks about traitors. I mean, people who are calling out this bullshit, right? I know exactly what you're going to do. You're going to continue to complain to men who care because they care about women. And they want to make sure that women are protected and provided for. At least they still do. And, the only thing that is going to destroy that is feminists asking for A and not A, to have their cake and eat it too, for men to protect them but give them freedom, constantly demanding contradictory things. They're going to constantly do this until men just completely emotionally shut down. They're going to be either offing themselves or quiet quitting until our society is no longer functional. Or we're just going to die because we no longer breed. Because apparently making this society that gives women rights go extinct is the new empowerment for women. There is something that she is not talking about. And that is what I constantly point out. Feminists have no plan to get out of men's world, to change men's world, to build their own world. Their only plan is to talk about how much this world oppresses them, how very much this world oppresses them, how awful it is, because then men will save them. That's it. That's their entire bloody plan. And they don't like women like me because I point it out. All right, so the next big L that Lilith engages in, this is L number 2. This is in response to my pointing out that women engage in sexual violence. And she says,
You want to extrapolate a small number on the majority of the female population.
and I just laugh. When I read that, I'm like, some anti-feminist points out that this is patriarchy theory. Yes, this is the entirety of feminist theory. And it's not even just you want to extrapolate the behavior of a small number of men, criminal men. They want to extrapolate the behavior, the motive of a small number of criminal men and the means of elite men. And that is man. That is their feminist Andronicus. A criminal man, and not just any criminal man, like a serial murderer rapist, like one of the rarest criminal types, but also the criminal type that's most likely to get shivved up his ass in prison because even other criminals hate him because he's so socially repulsive. That is the average man's motives. That is the emotional makeup of the average man. In addition to having the emotional makeup of a serial killer, rapist, the average man also has the material wealth and means of an elite man. That is the feminist Andronicus. And she's turning around and me just saying, hey, there are a lot of women be raping out there. Not all women, but just that they exist. That's me extrapolating a small number on the majority of the female pop. All right, okay, that is one big fat obvious L. But that's number 2. I'm not going to go too much further into it. It's just just perfect the way it is. All right, so the next thing she gets into, this is her next little adventure.
If there is anyone who has the most to lose from the collapse of the left, it's the average man and woman. Elites have everything to gain and nothing to lose.
From the collapse of the left. Now, that seems a pretty standard, communist statement or left statement. Oh, we're for the little guy and gal. That's what they usually say. Meanwhile, they support all kinds of loss of individual rights in favor of corporatist consumerism. But before, me and her got into an exchange, which I will detail right here. I thought you said that the elites were the only ones who cared about women. So now you're saying the elite men are the only ones saving women from the savage hordes of Feminist Andronicus. And this is her reply. This is what I tried to tell you since the beginning. Right after telling me that the elites are the only ones who can protect women who've ever done anything for women. And of course, they only did it because of capitalism. So capitalism is the only way that women ever got a foothold in anything, but also socialism is for the little guy. This is an L put through a paper shredder and turned into spaghetti, but it's still an L. This is the fourth L. This is the L that she took when we talked about bias against boys in school, right? I think that actually a lot of their failure is a result of bias against them by teachers in schools. So I put that to her, Lilith's disciple, that boys are failing in school due to bias against them. And I showed her an article that details a study looking into that. That study uses the term hardwired, and she fixates on it for a bit and demands that I explain it to her. And she does whatever. I explained that the explanation of hardwired is in the second paragraph. And she goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. All right. And this is where the conversation gets interesting.
I have just read it. There is no decisive conclusion. It's all about observing a pattern and proposing different hypothetical reasons for why this pattern exists.
There's no conclusion where the bias comes from. It doesn't mean that they haven't found bias. You really struggle with the idea that there are things that men don't choose and are outside of their control. The reason why I said that is because prior to this, we went back and forth on the issue of custody. And she really struggled with the idea that when custody or divorce cases are put before a judge, it's a judge making the decision, not men. When a judge would say something like, you didn't put time in with your kids, therefore you don't get 50-50 custody, she said, well, that's a man's choice. He chose to work instead of doing childcare. But the judge doesn't say to the mother or the wife, you chose to put in time to childcare, therefore the assets won't be split 50-50. These are decisions that the mother and the father are making, but only the decisions that the father is making are used to excuse judgments against him. I pointed this out to her. If a judge was saying that women don't deserve an equal split in assets because they don't work as much during the relationship, she would say that that is a negative decision by a judge. She wouldn't say, well, yes, of course, women made the choice not to work as much. But when it comes to custody, she points the finger at the man's choice not to do as much childcare and to do more work as an excuse for why the judge has made the decision. In both cases, it's the judge making the decision in the divorce. The decision is outside the hands of both the mother and the father, the husband and the wife, right? She has problems with that. She has problems recognizing that there are things outside of the control of men. Now that's just one example. So she'll appeal to the idea that men's rights activists or men's issues advocates say that women's choices have constructed the wage gap. There's nothing in the way of women's choices. There's no judge telling a woman to go be a secretary instead of an entrepreneur. There's nobody making these decisions for women. The judge is making the decision in the divorce. It's outside of the hands of both the man and the woman. You're just using the man's choices in his life to justify the judge's decision over his life. And you could equally do that with women, right? And if you really do want to get out of this whole diabolical pickle you're in with being oppressed by men, maybe you could start with challenging that attitude. But, I'm just a traitor. All right. So I point out that teachers are grading boys less. And she says,
Among the possible explanations given is that teachers tend to reward traits that are seen as typically female, such as neatness and sitting quietly in school because that makes their job easier. I am pretty sure boys can at least afford to do that.
the situation that they're talking about is the teacher grading a test. Maybe the teacher's thinking, oh, boys are such a pain in the ass, I'm going to grade her. But how's that on the boy? It has nothing to do with the test in front of the teacher. It's just their bias and stereotype towards the boy. And she's saying, well, if boys just were better, they wouldn't have stereotypes against them. Once again, reframing things in terms of the choices and actions of the boy rather than the boy being acted upon by a bigoted teacher. This is teachers doing something that is outside the boy's control. You really struggle with this concept outside a male individual's control.
The teachers might just as well be rewarding the traits that make their job easier, and these traits tend to be more found in girls than boys.
These teachers are grading tests. The only thing they could be rewarding is their own stereotypes about girls. I see that you insist on removing the possibility that something exists outside of boys' control.
Stereotypes tend to be stereotypes for a reason, and they never come from a void.
I say, what if this was reversed? Because teachers see girls as more conformist and less physically active, they give them lower grades due to the stereotype. Well, girls could learn to throw better and think more critically.
One of the major complaints about the current system of education by the MRA movement is that it expects boys to emulate feminine traits, leading to a forced feminized environment.
Yes. Right here you're saying, if boys want to be graded higher on tests, then they should emulate girls to avoid teachers' stereotypes when they're grading them. Oh, God, where the hell did... good Lord, where did this go? Twitter threading is the worst. You haven't answered the question. If teachers were grading girls lower, based on their stereotypes about girls, would you put it on girls to change? I'm not going to click these anymore because I'm terrified of Twitter threading.
I think you are failing to understand something here. All I am doing right now is use the same line of thought you guys do to shut down feminist criticism.
It's boys' choices to act in boy ways, thus creating a stereotype in the teacher's mind that causes them to grade them less on in a quiet room with no boys' presence, to simply say, oh, I hate boys, and grade them less. That's because boys don't act like girls. That's why it's justified. And it's like, no. An equivalent wouldn't be women make the choices that they do in terms of the wage gap. Equivalent would be that we live in a Futurama world where girls are assigned jobs based on the job sorting robot. That somebody else is choosing the job for them. Somebody else is choosing the boy's grade for them. And that somebody else that's choosing the job for the girl is choosing those jobs based on stereotypes. And you're justifying it because, well, if the girls didn't want to be sorted into nursing and secretarial work, then they should act more like boys. See? One thing is out of the boys' control, which is being graded by sexist teachers. The other thing is within women's control, choice of their jobs. And then she goes into the sex trade. I ask her, what the fuck does the sex trade have to do with the answer? And I just give her the question again.
It's related to it in the sense that I am using the same arguments you guys use to dismiss the concerns of feminists in more critical issues. To answer your question, nobody should have to emulate the traits of the opposite sex, and education needs to be segregated by sex.
So the fact that women's choices in employment result in lower wages is a more serious issue than the fact that boys are subject to systemic discrimination in schools leading to lower grades in the first place. You can only perceive the victimhood when I reframed it as an issue facing female students. Your immediate impulse was to see a way that boys were being acted upon by others and reframe it in terms of boys' own actions being to blame. This is the gender bifurcation at the heart of everything. And it's also the reason why you never answer the question of how you're going to get one over on men without confronting them directly. Because you're already getting one over on them. And she responds with, I'm only using your own framing the issues feminists talk about against you in case you haven't noticed. I learned this from listening and reading your own arguments. But it doesn't mean that I genuinely believe it, and you're fleeing from it. She's doing a no you, except the issue is that she's comparing adult women making choices, their own choices in their employment, with boys being graded lower by sexist teachers. There's no comparison. Again, the judge is making the choice in the divorce. The teacher is making the choice for the grade. The woman is making the choice of employment. There is a difference there. Somebody is acting upon these men and boys, and she immediately reframes it in terms of their choices, leading to the excuse being made by the authority figure to do the negative thing that they're doing. And she is seeing that as equivalent to the free choices of women in the marketplace. There's a perceptual mismatch.
You guys have no problems dismissing our own talking points using that same line of thought. But don't expect us to do the same to you.
See, this is where do you go with this? Like, how do you, she thinks it's equivalent. A woman making a choice in a job, what educational opportunity she's going to pursue, is equivalent to a boy being marked down by a teacher because he's a boy. She sees an equivalence there. Where do you go from there? And I say you consider MRA's arguments legitimate when it comes to situations that affect women, girls and women, but not men. That's what this shows. It's entirely a perceptual issue. I'm just capable of perceiving something you aren't. And this is systemic with feminists. I got into a feminist when I was talking about the statutory rape of boys by educators and other staff in schools. And she brought up adolescence and said, well, that boy was really scary to that therapist. Therefore, boys can't be forced by women, herp-a-derp. Like, they cannot see. They literally cannot see anything outside of men and boys' control. And the instant, like the judge making a decision in a divorce, that's within the man's control because he could have chosen to do more childcare. But of course, if the judge was making the decision to split the assets more in favor of the man because he did more of the work, the feminist would come back and say, oh, that's the judge's bias against women. I think it's a perceptual issue, guys. I think we are just capable of perceiving the idea that there are things outside the control of men and boys. And what's really funny is if you can't even take that first step to recognizing there are things outside the control of men and boys, how are you ever supposed to do that thing you're talking about of constructing a block of women to escape? If you can't conceive of anything outside the control of men and boys, you could be like a supposed slave in a field. And your master is 300 miles away and the field's open and you can go wherever you want. And you're like, oh, wait, master must have control here somewhere. You're just screwing yourself with your own mind, ladies. How do you know you're not doing that? Okay. Anyway, thank you for your kind attention. I hope you're having a lovely evening, afternoon, second brunch, whatever you're doing, wherever you are. And see you in the next one.